In this episode of Everything Compliance, Matt Kelly takes a look at the Gary Gensler confirmation hearing and the climate change issues that are currently being debated within the Securities and Exchange Commission. Mike Volkov tells us what a CCO needs to know about antitrust investigations and enforcement under the Biden administration. Jonathan Marks reviews the recently concluded Baker-Tilly Fraud Summit. What were some of the key highlights and the engagement of the audience? Jay Rosen looks at diversity and inclusion, why this is becoming more important for corporate culture and the role of the compliance function in diversity and inclusion. Shout-outs and rants follow the commentary. Thanks for listening. Live stream edition of Everything Compliance. Today we have the gang of Jay Rosen, Michael Volkov, Jonathan Marks, and Matt Kelly. Gentlemen, first of all, welcome.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Tom.
And Thanks, Tom. Mike, we are going to start with you. You are our resident antitrust expert, and I was wondering if you might be able to shed a little light about antitrust investigations, really from the compliance perspective, and what does a CCO or compliance type need to know about antitrust, the division, and antitrust compliance?
Well, first off, the parlance that you use, the division, is the way that everybody who works in the antitrust division speaks about it. It is the division, the only division in the Justice Department. They're so proud of their institution. But I think, look, let's take a step back. We have Merrick Garland coming in, and if anybody saw his confirmation hearing, I expect him to obviously sail through, and he should be approved within the next week or so. There are various names that are being suggested as the new Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division, one of whom who's very well regarded is named Susan Davies. She used to work for Senator Leahy on the Judiciary Committee, very highly regarded within the antitrust bar. So that would be a good step. But I think when looking at your risks, you have to think first off what is going to be the enforcement environment. We've seen a definite rise in private antitrust litigation, and that will continue. But enforcement risks, I think, are going to increase, particularly in the civil side, not in the criminal side. Criminal will probably return to sort of internationally focused cartel activity. They've been focused mainly on domestic cartels, and some of the famous cases from years ago involving the Informer and involving international cartel activity that had an impact on the United States was very aggressively prosecuted by the Justice Department, and I think we'll see a resumption of that. But all in all, the criminal work is pretty steady. The other thing to look at in the criminal area is if you have government contracting business, that's going to be a high risk going forward, because they've created a sort of collusion task force to focus on government contractors. So those are two areas. Now, compliance and antitrust is sort of a schizophrenic existence. And here's why I say that. For years, legal sort of just handled antitrust issues because they said they should. And on the civil side, you can have some difficult legal analysis, economic analysis issues, and they tend to be the ones in the front lines in those. The thing that what I've noticed is compliance departments are taking over with a greater increase, I think, in the last few years, is cartel prevention and detection. In other words, criminal activity, because that's right in the wheelhouse of a chief compliance officer. Number one, you're already dealing with anti-corruption issues, and a lot of these tend to flow with the same types of risks and people that are involved in international activity. So chief compliance officers are taking over that to a greater degree, and obviously they're great at training, they're great at setting up controls, they're great at setting as much as they can up in terms of prevention. So where do I see this going is I would like to see more attention paid by chief compliance officers to this risk. They tend to generally train on it talk about it, but the controls that need to be set up. And for example, we've worked with Baker Tilly, for example, in looking at doing risk assessments and looking at companies for where their risks really, the risky interactions may occur, and then come through and audit them, which is very important. One note, however, with regard to traditional audits and with regard to traditional prevention activities with regard to antitrust is, if you look at the recent chicken producers conspiracy, which is being prosecuted in Denver, and we just had a plea by Pilgrim's Pride, one of the second biggest chicken producer in the country, and a $107 million fine, and we have 10 individuals who are being prosecuted. What's incredible about this conspiracy is that it all occurred through texts and occasional phone calls. All the text messages where they coordinated bids on chicken producing contracts to Kentucky Fried Chicken and other places were orchestrated through texts. And what I worry about is encrypted texts. And when do we get to this? In this case, they used just regular text, and they didn't use an encrypted technology. But it was carried out entirely that way. And so what they had to do was do a lot of sort of spade work to get into this and to uncover the cartel. So the challenge is to be proactive in this area. Chief compliance officers have to raise the issue again and again and again to get support for more and more controls that need to be put in place. By that I mean bidding processes have to have committee controls or review controls so that bidding activities are also under scrutiny. What's the biggest risk? And I hate to say this, and it goes back to an issue that I just is infuriating. It's the C-suite, because these are, in all the chicken cases, were carried out by CEOs, number ones, number twos at the company. And again, compliance is always reluctant to bring up, we need to do a C-suite risk assessment. It's a tough issue to do, but if you look at the pattern of cases and how often the C-suite is involved in not only antitrust but any other area, these are things that have to be looked at. So anyways, I see, Matt, you have a question, so go.
Well, just a thought here, as I'm listening to your point, Mike, about encrypted text, which I think is very real as a threat there. And I was wondering how Justice Department prosecutors would try and penetrate a scheme running by heavily encrypted texts. And I'm wondering about their ability to use data analytics to look at price machinations or price movements or the lack of price movements or the uniformity of movements. But it just seems that the DOJ talks so much about data analytics. I'm wondering how they would try to apply analysis to pricing fluctuations, especially in commodities like beef, pork, orange juice futures, or whatever, right, when the written evidence might be harder to find.
Well, you raise a great point, because in the guidance that came out from the Justice Department's Antitrust Division in 2019 about compliance programs in the Antitrust Division, it was a separate document from the Criminal Division's document. And in it, one of the proactive strategies that they urged companies to use are statistical analyses and programs themselves internally. And, just like we had the access to data issue with regard to the Criminal Division's guidance, lo and behold, the department is saying, we want you to watch these fluctuations, these changes in prices. We want you to look for evidence of it as part of your compliance program to prevent and detect. So you raise a really good point. I also think that, a lot of times in the encrypted text context, if they're on WhatsApp, for example, and they get access to the phone, then they can sometimes recover those, but who knows? I mean, I've heard of the disappearing technology where you use a text and then it's gone within seconds after that. So what I think it makes it more difficult, but it'll go back to bread and butter flipping people, and then getting insiders to talk, and then hopefully having some ability to corroborate it. But it was amazing that you say that, because in the chicken case, they had to use circumstantial evidence as well. They would have, for example, a phone call or a change in price, but they didn't have the substance beyond that. And then they built around that testimony or some, in many cases, texts. And that's so it's going to be a more of a challenge. But look, they're up to it. I think they'll do. They'll make it. But I think, look, antitrust is. I think it's going to be a big issue. I think the civil side is going to be more of an area. So the lawyers will be sharpening their pencils, getting ready to sort of deal with civil enforcement issues. The other big news, I think, is that they're going to go forward full speed ahead with the Google and Facebook cases. And I think Merrick Garland, when he was testifying, said he didn't see any reason to change course on those cases at all, and that's a good thing. So you're going to see more aggressive enforcement. You're going to see more integrity from the Justice Department, and you're going to see antitrust risks going up. And I hope that people will start to pay attention to it again. But companies need to, particularly in the global marketplace.
Mike, I have a question that's a little bit different focus. Not if, but when Merrick Garland called you and asked, Mike, what do I need to do to rebuild the Justice Department, both internally and externally? What are two or three of the top things that you think he needs to do to rebuild morale within not just the division, but the department?
Well, I think he's going to lead by example, number one. Number two, he also committed to going to all of, many of the offices to meet with people. I think he's going to uncover atrocities that we have no idea, and it's going to get worse. But I think he's going to want to move forward. I have to tell you, he's one of the most impressive persons I ever worked with besides you four. He is really an amazing person. And he is brilliant, and he'll do the right thing at every step of the way. I just thought he handled the hearing so well, and I think he realizes that people are desperate for some kind of leadership and integrity. And I think it'll be interesting to see the people who come in and work with him. I think he has a very loyal following of very good lawyers who've worked with him in one way or another. And I think you're going to see really a lot of integrity and a lot of, he has to prioritize things. He was already speaking during the hearing. He was saying, look, there's a cost benefit. His analysis of marijuana prosecutions is it's a cost benefit analysis. Is it worth the resources, and what's the result we get? And I think he sees higher priorities. I don't think he's the type, though, that's going to go back and regurgitate all the criminal activity during the Trump administration, particularly when he has the states and New York and Georgia pretty aggressively going after a lot of that. I think he wants to move forward and restore the Justice Department. I would say this: I think he's going to get into the weeds on one prosecution, and that's the insurrection prosecution. And if there's anybody who will be aggressive about it, he won't care where that leads. He won't care if it means that there are certain Congress people who may have aided or abetted any of the insurrection activities. He'll go after them. And it be a Democrat or Republican. I don't think he really doesn't care in that. He's not a really hardcore partisan in that sense.
Jay Rosen, what has been on your mind?
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to talk about diversity and inclusion, or D&I. And during the month of February, Affiliated Monitors was honored to have Jennifer Newton, CEO and founder of the National Association of Black Compliance Risk Management Professionals, I know that's a mouthful, and Joseph West, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer from the law firm Duane Morris, and they both appeared on our new Integrity Through Compliance podcast. Newton discussed the origin of her organization, which goes by the acronym NAMCRIMP, and was founded in 2019. The nonprofit organization is dedicated to the professional development of African American compliance and risk management professionals. And members of the organization represent corporations, financial institutions, law firms, accountants, consulting firms, government agencies, trade associations, universities, and nonprofits. The idea was really to create an organization that encompasses the broad nature of compliance and how does it tend to be more so across industry fields in which individuals who work in compliance and risk management may work in various types of fields. So why is this important, and what's the business case for this? Compliance plays a unique role in organizations as the sort of gatekeeper for managing risk throughout the enterprise. Since organizations understand and fully grasp risk, whether we're talking about regulatory risk, whether we're talking about financial risk, it's something that many organizations typically grasp and they understand very well. And one of the things that organizations have not been great at in the past is understanding the risk that's posed from the lack of diversity and inclusion, internally and externally to the organization. And so as the gatekeepers and the stewards of managing risk in an organization, compliance professionals have an obligation to manage all aspects of risk, including the risks that present itself from the lack of diversity and inclusion in the organization and externally. And no longer should it be seen as a human issue, an HR issue. Diversity inclusion should be seen as central to making sure that organizations are managing risks in all firms, including the risk that comes from failing to have diversity and inclusion embedded throughout the company. So especially now where ESG is so important, and you hear the coming out of every boardroom, you hear that as part of the objectives from all in-house organizations. Environmental, social, and governance is the buzzword of the day. And now the potential impact that the failure to mitigate those risks could have on an organization. That makes it a business issue that requires compliance to be important for organizations to take initiative, some efforts to create compliance management programs. Because the failure to do so, the failure to mitigate risk, creates potential issues that could show up in reputation and financial impacts and regulatory and legal sanctions. So in essence, that's the business case for the management of compliance within your organization. Finally, a company's potential tarnishing of its brand can be amplified by social media, and unfortunately, that can last forever. It's something that a company may not be able to recover from, depending on how bad or how egregious the issue is. Now, more so, customers and clients, they do not allow you to forget. And so the change in the client base has affected how organizations need to sort of manage their reputation a lot better because it does pose potential risks. And when you look at it, who and how customers choose to patronize for business, historically, the prior generation before this, the new millennial and Generation Zers, are more focused on cost efficiency, the value proposition of what organizations are providing, and just about the very basic business traits that corresponded well within the product you're getting. Next up, we spoke to Joseph West, who's a partner and the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer of the law firm Duane Morris. He's a successful litigator who represented Fortune 100 corporations globally, and he's an accomplished, nationally recognized subject matter expert on D&I. Joseph went in-house with Entergy Corporation in about 1999 and handled a large number of litigation matters, commercial litigation, contract disputes, regulatory matters, and catastrophic injury tort cases. He ended up being recruited into Walmart's legal department at the beginning of 2007, and his time there was almost evenly split between class action complex litigation group, and at one point he was named the head of the outside management group. Joseph was responsible for managing Walmart's relationships with all its outside law firms globally. It was during this time at Walmart where he headed the outside counsel management group, and he first gained an appreciation and understanding, particularly for the business case. We hear that again, for diversity. And the general counsel who recruited Joseph to Walmart was a guy named Tom Mars. Tom was one of those ahead of the curve general counsels who saw the value of diversity and inclusion. And he pushed the group that Joseph had led to increase both the number of women and minority relationship partners in large firms, as well as the number of women and minority-owned law firms that did outside work for Walmart. And in the space of about 2 years, the department shifted about $60 million worth of business to women and minority-owned firms, women and minority relationship partners. The quality of the work went through the roof. The level of responsiveness and engagement from outside counsel also went through the roof. And the scores whereby Walmart's internal business clients evaluated the work of the legal department was also astronomically through the roof. This story illustrates the connection between diversity and inclusion and excellence. People still cling to the notion that the two things are mutually exclusive, and they're not. That was the thing that made it apparent to Joseph that diversity and inclusion was important. In terms of the title and position of Chief Diversity Officers, it's a relatively new phenomenon. The Chief Diversity Inclusion Officers at law firms, and the most common model is for someone who's not a practicing attorney or who doesn't have a significant role in leadership. Joe thinks the better model is the one that he has at Duane Morris, and that is where a partner at the firm, somebody who has an active book of business, is actively practicing law and heads up the diversity and inclusion work. The reason why he thinks that model works better is because partners in large firms are responsive to people who they consider to be peers and who they think have a certain amount of gravitas within the firm. It makes it a little bit more difficult to get people's attention or to get resources committed to the issues that are important to the firm and to get them to understand that external stakeholders, namely a firm's clients, care about this stuff too. But if you don't have clients, it's kind of hard to go to your partners and say, this is something our clients want. When you talk about diversity and inclusion, particularly at a law firm, you're usually talking about that business case, and you're trying to convince the firm leadership of the business case for diversity and inclusion. The fact is, we all know and believe that a meaningful approach to diversity and inclusion is the right thing to do, but the fact is, not everybody sees it that way. Every organism on this planet is motivated by self-interest. And if you get people to understand that treating diversity and inclusion like a core component of the business organization, then they understand that they've got skin in the game and they know what's in it for me. And you know, there's a couple of things. If you're a law firm, the fact is a growing number of your clients care about these issues. In 2012, there were maybe 3 out of the Fortune 500 companies that had a chief diversity and inclusion officer, and now 3/4 of the Fortune 500 have a chief diversity and inclusion officer. And sometimes it's even part of the C-suite. People who are responsive to and responsible to and connect with the CEO and the boards of directors. There are committees now on boards of directors focused on D&I because they understand 2 things. One, diversity and inclusion means that diversity is about the workforce. Inclusion is about the workplace. The entirety of your organization depends on the health and well-being of your workforce and your workplace. So diversity and inclusion is really at the core of everything you do. Diversity is like being asked to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. There's a difference if you went to a financial advisor and somebody was going to manage your portfolio and they said, oh, don't diversify your assets. You would fire that person immediately because that doesn't make any sense. There is strength in diversity, and on our currency, we have the phrase e pluribus unum, which means of many one. And that signifies to you that the fact that diversity is in fact our strength. There are tons of studies that show this. McKinsey's done studies, Forbes, Cravath, and the diverse groups have been known to perform better. They have a better ROI and they are more creative. So the business case for diversity has been made manifest across a lot of different platforms. There's no organization out there that would say that they have ethics as a core value. A lot of organizations claim that diversity is a core value, but you wouldn't have an ethics guy just come in once a year and give a lecture and then leave, and then you go about doing your business. If ethics is a core value that you live by, and if you live by it every day in everything you do with every conversation, then every decision you make needs to be guided by ethical principles. The same thing applies to diversity and inclusion. If it's a core value, then it's part of your DNA and your organization, and everything you do is guided by it. And if it's all part of your decision making, it's all part of your actions as well. Every organization may be at different points in their journey, Some of them may have robust diversity and inclusion programs, but even within that ecosystem, there are some issues that are problematic. So we've looked at the issue now, both from an in-house perspective with Joseph West and a trade organization perspective. And we've heard two similar theses, that it's the business case for diversity and inclusion that should win out at the end of the day.
Matt, do you have a question for Jay?
More just an observation. It strikes me that for anybody involved in the financial services sector and banking in particular, very clear that the regulators, the lawmakers in Congress are going to look closely at how banks are providing equitable financial services to minority audiences who have been woefully neglected for many, many years. So when people ask, why is this important? Well, you're not going to be able to fulfill that sort of priority very well if you've got insufficient diversity among your workforce in financial services, and especially among the management. And then the other issue that intrigues me about this, and I don't think we've really seen how this is all going to shake out, is the intersection between the company's commitment to diversity and how that might affect some of its other corporate priorities. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Coca-Cola, which is these days well ahead of the curve and doing a great job on trying to talk about diversity and diversity in its management ranks, in its workforce, and its suppliers. They play it up very well. Now they are running under fire because on the political support side and political spending side, Coca-Cola, which is based in Atlanta, makes campaign contributions to several lawmakers in Georgia who are supporting the voter suppression drive that Republicans in Georgia are trying to force through. And now people are saying, well, Coca-Cola, how can you be supporting them while you support diversity? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but it's worth noting that we're going to see these kind of issues come up for large corporations more and more often. That's just example number 509 of the zillions that I think we're going to see over the coming years.
I think you bring up a great point, Matt. And like you said, there's 508 other reasons. You just want one more to get 509, and maybe they'll give you that in Georgia. Anyone else? Tom, I'll throw it back to you.
Jonathan Marks, you last week had led the wildly successful Baker Tilly First Annual Fraud Summit. As a participant, I thought it was fabulous. As a listener, I thought it was even better. You had great numbers of attendees. You had incredible engagement. And I really wanted to ask you if you could maybe wrap up some of the lessons you learned, what are the key engagement points you saw, and really how you're going to take this forward because it was such a great event.
Thanks, Tom. It certainly takes a lot of people to put that on, and I'm very grateful that the entire Everything Compliance cast participated. Jonathan Armstrong's not here today, but thank you to him as well. So a sincere thank you to all of you. Early numbers in, unaudited, obviously, there were 2,570 people that registered for the event. I think some of the sessions garnered close to 900 or 1,000 people, which I think was phenomenal. I monitored the questions and the participants and some of the things that were going back and forth. I came up with a couple of themes, which I thought are kind of interesting, but probably not surprising to most. There was also one session where people were like, well, why is that there? And we're going to build on that. And I'll tell you what that is in a second. But, Tom, with you and Mary Shirley and Jay leading us off and Mike on what to expect under the new administration, and Matt with your session on internal controls. I mean, we really are covering a lot of the things that are near and dear to everybody else. Elizabeth Simon's presentation on mapping ethical risks and some of the other things that, were talked about, clearly people were very interested in, which I think is great. I hope to do it better next year. So stay tuned for, the dates next year, and, stay tuned for the lineup for next year. I'm working on that already. But some of the themes that I saw and some of the themes that we're actually experiencing in practice, which I'm happy to share, are people are not monitoring what's going on in a remote environment, and they're getting burned for it. I can't tell you how many times in the last 5 weeks somebody told me that as a result of COVID, we haven't monitored the activity like we did pre-COVID. And I'm telling everybody out there right now, if you're not, you got to figure out a way to get in front of people. The other thing is that you probably all know that one of my crazy models that I've built over the years are the enemies of internal controls, which are people, judgments, workarounds, and one of the other things that I've added to that is incentives. Listening to Eric Feldman speak about incentive and incentive compensation and why people are driven, a lot of people are driven to that. It was one of the risks that I actually identified early on in COVID, but it seems to be one of those things that I think there's a lot of conversation and people are coming back to that. What I'm talking about is that, people are trying to make up for lost time. People are trying to maintain, what they had. And I think there's a lot of fraud that's happened. I think there's a lot of fraud that's happening. And I expect to be very busy for the next 3 to 5 years. So the two key things, that I saw, that were kind of mostly talked about were incentive compensation and this sort of remote monitoring and continuous auditing type of discussion, that went on. The other thing that I thought was extremely interesting is, people are now talking about internal controls and books and records, which, before was sort of, well, I'm not an accountant, that's not really my thing. But I think people are more and more concerned about, what's going on from a books and records perspective, and I think they should be. And so, that was sort of, one of those top 5 things that I keep seeing that are coming out. And then, when Matt started to talk about internal controls, there were some conversations in the discussion in the chat room, but I got a lot of, pings offline from folks that were, we're not sure that we're building the right controls. We're not sure that we're building controls to deter and detect fraud. How does compliance really know the controls that are being put in by, I'll dub it, management, are appropriate? What should internal audit be doing in order to make sure that those controls are properly designed? So, I see that enterprise ecosystem kind of coming together more and more and more, and building something that's a little bit more resilient. I think today is going to truly involve the coordination between internal audit, compliance, and the legal function. Those were some of the key things. And then the last thing that I noticed was there was an extreme interest, which again I think is phenomenal, from a lot of people on kind of what happened and lessons learned. How can we learn from things that happened in 2020, and how can we be better prepared, in the future? A lot of discussion. I got a lot of emails, a lot of text messages, a lot of chat messages from people where, can you point me to a case that talks about this? Can you? So again, I know that we've all preached this, and I don't want to come off as preachy, but I know that we all read those cases, as part of our mantra on an ongoing basis. And we all try to take lessons learned from that. I'm telling you right now, when you're doing your training, if you're not using those cases as examples of really what could go wrong, and using sort of the remediation that somebody, either the DOJ or the SEC, sometimes kind of recommends, I think that's a huge mistake. And then the last thing, which I thought was extremely interesting, was I probably got about 300, probably close to 400 pings on LinkedIn for root cause. It wasn't sort of the number one thing that was talked about, but people were talking about root cause, not really sure how to do it, don't really understand it. Isn't an investigation root cause? What could we be doing differently in order to build this into our process? We say this in our manuals that we have, but nobody really knows how to do it, or we just don't do it. Does that hurt us? So I think it's kind of interesting there too. So, when I kind of round everything up, it's really all the things that we're all talking about on a regular and ongoing basis. But I think one of the things that the summit really highlighted is that people are thirsty to get that information. They're thirsty for that knowledge. I applaud everyone who attended, because I too was a listener and actually learned things throughout the summit, and I thought it was phenomenal from a learning perspective. So, each one of you, again, I really thank you very, very, very much, and I hope everybody enjoyed it and they all come back next year.
Jonathan, I have a question about the format of a virtual event. I've participated with you in multiple events over the years. I've seen you put on live events. Obviously, your reach with this event was extraordinarily much broader than a Philadelphia or even U.S. focused event. Where do you see virtual learning, or more specifically, virtual conferences? Is it something that will stay with us, or do you think we'll go back to live conferences pretty quick?
Well, I think there's something to be gained from live conferences, and it's not usually when the speaker is speaking. It's usually afterwards where you bump into someone and you start commiserating about something that happened and say, "Hey, I'm in this sticky wicket. Do you have some advice for me or whatever?" I think that's one of the things that's really lost in a virtual event. So I'm trying to come up with a way to, I think we all are like, hey, reach out to us, let us know what's going on. But I think some people really feel uncomfortable in a sort of I'll use the non-Chatham House environment, right? But I think from a virtual perspective, one of the things that I noticed was, and again, these are preliminary things that I just saw, it seemed like people had their choice of things that they wanted to attend, and they can go about their normal day, if in fact they had things to do. I will tell you that there's discussion about replaying some of those throughout the year so that people can get a second whack at these, and, stay tuned for more information on that. But I think the virtual conference is here to stay. I really do. I don't know where you can amass 2,500 people basically for free, right? We didn't charge a nickel. There was no cost for this. It's not like you're spending $1,000 to attend a conference and $500 a day for a hotel room and meals. I mean, I think from a bang from your buck perspective, we were able to get speakers that I thought, outside our core group that normally probably we wouldn't be able to get due to time constraints or whatever. So, I'm extremely optimistic. I think as technology grows and we can get more clever with this, maybe there's a way to do, fireside chats and things of that nature, which I hope to do something with next year. That's sort of on my list of things to do. Maybe there are some private rooms that we can create for people to break off and ask, specific questions. I'm thinking about a workshop pre and post, maybe in smaller groups, maybe to get people talking about specific things. But I think, Tom, from a virtual perspective, I think it's here to stay. I know organizations are saving big money by not sending people all over the place. And I feel bad for the hospitality industry and the airline industry. But from a selfish perspective, we're able to reach folks on their time, under, I think, comfortable circumstances, and allow people to go about their days without, packing up a suitcase, running off, spending thousands of dollars. And, a lot of times attending one or two of the sessions, and, the other times, maybe doing something else, meeting up with different people, which again, I think that's what's really lost there, is that camaraderie and be able to communicate with those folks. But, at the end of the day, I think it's here to stay. And from what I'm hearing from everybody else, I mean, they're all waiting for the dates for next year. So if that's any indication, I think it's a good one.
So, Matt Kelly, you have been writing and talking about Gary Gensler since he was nominated by now President Biden.
Yep.
What did you see, if anything, out of his confirmation hearing, and what are you seeing about climate change issues at the Securities and Exchange Commission?
So we're seeing a lot of stuff. And yes, Gary Gensler had his confirmation hearing a few days ago where for ethics and compliance officers specifically, it's probably more interesting what the Senate Banking Committee senators did not talk about. And they did not talk about so much. I made up a list, but they did actually press him a bit on climate change disclosures. And we have other SEC climate change news. So I want to get to that too. But so here's Gary Gensler, who ran the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission as chairman for the Obama administration for, I think, about 5 years. He's been teaching at MIT since then in the management school, and spending a lot of time talking about fintech and cryptocurrency. And he comes up for the Senate Banking Committee hearing only about 2 or 3 weeks after all of that nonsense on GameStop that we saw with that stock feeding frenzy a few weeks ago, and also a lot of attention paid to Bitcoin. So that's the circumstance. And boom, here's Gary Gensler. Here's what the Banking Committee didn't talk about at all. They did not talk about stronger SEC enforcement. They did not talk about the rate of IPOs in the United States. They didn't really talk about the SEC's budget or operations, beyond Gensler saying that he thinks that he's going to wind up moving the SEC headquarters in a couple of years because that's a big long-term project for the commission. They didn't talk about auditing standards. They didn't talk about the PCAOB and its role regulating audit standards. They didn't talk about whistleblower awards, either at the SEC or whistleblower protections generally. They didn't talk about internal controls over financial reporting. They didn't talk about SOX 404B. They did not even talk about special purpose acquisition companies, SPACs, which are those contraptions sprouting like weeds, where they're these publicly traded holding companies that then go buy up private companies and poof, you're suddenly public. None of that came up. It was really striking to see that absence of discussion. Most of the senators focused on GameStop and how the SEC might approach these online trading frenzies. GameStop is the most sexy of the examples, but there have been a bunch of companies that have seen wild swings because these day traders on Reddit are doing all sorts of, I don't know if it's price manipulation or they're just on some sort of financial joyride. But there was a lot of talk about that. There was some talk about cryptocurrency and how you would try and regulate cryptocurrency as an asset, which I think is going to be a big issue. And it is worth noting that the frenzies around GameStop and how fintech enables that, the concerns and questions about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. If you want a well-qualified SEC chairman to handle issues like that, Gary Gensler is your man. He has been studying that kind of stuff for years. He dealt with it sort of in a prototype way when he was at the CFTC, which was dealing with commodity products, and I would argue that Bitcoin is a commodity. So Gary Gensler's a really smart guy, and he's really well-versed in some big challenges that the SEC is going to have to confront. So get to the question of, is the committee going to confirm him? I mean, yes, because they're Democratic controlled. And is the Senate going to confirm him? I think so. I haven't seen any Republicans really give Gensler that much grief. And he has got the liberal wing nailed down. Elizabeth Warren was beaming as she talked with Gary Gensler during his hearing. But more than that, I think a lot of Republicans know if you're going to be stuck with a Democratic SEC chairman because it's a Democratic administration, if that is the Republicans' fate, they could do a whole lot worse than to have Gary Gensler be your Democratic SEC chairman that you're stuck with. He's a very smart guy. So I would not be surprised if he does get confirmed. I don't think it's going to be 99-0 or 99-1, but I also don't think it's going to be 52 or 53 votes in favor. I think he's going to win by a confirmation by a comfortable margin. Now we get to the one thing that came up that was somewhat contentious, which was ESG issues and principally climate change. That was the one back and forth that the Republican ranking member on the banking committee, Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania, he kind of gave Gensler a bit of a hard time on whether the SEC would start requiring more corporate disclosure around climate change risks, around diversity and inclusion, and around political spending. And how could these things, which are not for almost every business, they are not financially significant, how could they therefore be material where the SEC would decide that they should be disclosed? And you know, the Republicans stuck a lot on this idea that if it's financially insignificant, it can't be material. And Gensler came back and said, well, no, he was sticking with the Supreme Court's ruling on materiality, which basically is that investors will decide for themselves what material is to them, and we're going to respect that as a commission. So I think the real fault line that you're going to see, and probably in court as these things get challenged, because I suspect that they will, but the question is really going to be this: could an item be financially insignificant, but still ethically and socially significant enough that the SEC would decide we're going to make that a disclosure requirement anyways? That's the issue. And Gensler is very much going to say, yes, that's logically sound. And as soon as that's logically sound, well, now I can require more climate change disclosure or diversity disclosure or political spending. And now for compliance officers, you should start thinking, oh boy, how are we actually going to track that data? What's our framework to use? How are we going to test it? How are we going to report it? Because that's coming. And that brings me to my next issue, is that what we saw this week at the SEC was a lot of discussion around more climate change disclosure. Last week, the acting chairman, Allison Herron-Lee, she said that she had directed SEC staff to start reviewing corporate financial disclosures more rigorously, starting right now, to see how much these disclosures hew to the SEC guidance about disclosure of climate change. That's guidance from 2010, which is not really very substantive, but they're going to be looking at that specifically to see what enhancements they should make to begin the process. And she didn't say, so maybe we will. They are going to begin to develop potential new climate change guidance. Is that going to be a rule? Is it going to be a dear CFO, please do this kind of a letter? We don't know what the final form would take. But Allison Herron-Lee put that out last week. Then this week, she said she is directing the Division of Enforcement to start looking at climate change disclosures and whether there are any enforceable violations there. I don't necessarily know even what a violation along climate change disclosure, like what would that look like? If you're a operating company, are you fibbing about how much greenhouse gas emissions you put out? I don't know if it's material or what. Where would you define that? If you're a financial firm and you're promising that you're an ESG investment fund, but you're really investing in coal mines, I can see where that's fraudulent. But is that an SEC thing? Or would the SEC kick that over to the Federal Trade Commission to get in your face over a false advertising charge? Like, I don't know how all that works. But so we have Corp Fin looking at your disclosures. We have enforcement looking at your disclosures. And then, boom, we have the Republican commissioners on the SEC putting out their own statements saying, whoa, 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 hold on, folks. Let's remember that all we should be doing is looking at whether you have violated existing SEC standards around climate change disclosure, which, of course, in my humble opinion, these existing standards for disclosure are about as ephemeral and vague as a spritz of perfume during a hurricane. I mean, you can't really draw a hard line around any of that. So it's always fun to see dueling statements from the Democratic and Republican commissioners. It's rare that you see it. But now we have it over climate change. And I think the Republicans are starting to lay down some markers for when, so basically telling companies to be on the lookout for over-aggressive enforcement right now, and also signaling to other Republicans who are anti-climate change attention that maybe we should think about how would you litigate a new rule if that comes up, or what sort of other friction there will be. But there will be friction sometime in the future. But very clearly, Gensler, assuming he's confirmed, and I think that's true, like he is going to pick up these climate change efforts and he's going to run with that ball as far as he can. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening on that subject right now.
Jonathan Marks, do you have a question for Matt?
Yeah, Matt. I recall in 2007, there was, I was involved in this whole thing called social responsibility.
Yeah.
And, we thought we were groundbreaking in trying to understand exactly what that was and how it should be disclosed and things of that nature. I just wonder if the timing of all this is really being considered. A lot of the engine rooms in these companies are overtaxed right now and dealing with the pandemic and other crises that are going on. And layering this thing on, I think is, it may be something that I believe it's probably worthwhile. I'm not saying that environmental, social, and government type issues should not be disclosed, but what I'm really saying is anybody really looking at this in its totality and the stress and strain that it's going to put on organizations to get this right, and penalizing them for not doing it in this type of an environment? I don't know that that's fair. But your thoughts?
Well, I think the question is really, so what's the it that they are they doing it or are they not doing it? And I suspect what a lot of forces in the Biden administration and in Congress want to do is to adopt a more strenuous and precise framework for what you're supposed to disclose. It is not wrong to say that if you have a physical plant that is along the fire zones in the West Coast and the hurricane zones in Texas, and conceivably a weather disaster could leave your business offline, like, yeah, that's a big risk, and you should put that in a 10Q. On the other hand, it's really interesting. So one of the Republicans brought up, let's say Apple with $275 billion in revenue a year. They donate $1 million in political contributions. Should that be disclosed? Is that important? Because it's a piddling amount of money to Apple. Well, would investors make a decision about that? It kind of sort of depends. If Apple was splitting it 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans, would anybody care? Probably not. If they were putting it all to the neo-Nazi or the Communist Party, would everybody care? Probably yes. So who's to say what you're supposed to do with that? I mean, clearly the Democrats think they're to say, and Republicans think nobody is to say. There's a lot of money involved in institutional investors who want this done more forcefully. So I don't know. It's a valid point that there's a lot of other stuff that companies are struggling with. But I think ultimately the SEC is going to wind up pointing to a framework to say this is a more comprehensive way you should be thinking about it. And then comes the rule proposal and the comment period and then the inevitable litigation. And we're talking about getting it done by 2029 as opposed to next week. But I think that's kind of where it's going to go.
Okay.
Gentlemen, we are now to our fan favorite shout outs and rants. So we're going to keep the same order. Mike Volkov, do you have a shout out and or rant for us? You're on mute, Mike.
I have a shout out for us. I would shout out what I thought was a great confirmation hearing. I also, just backing up to Matt's, I think Gensler's definitely did a great job, and I think he's going to get confirmed as well. I can't see anybody, stomping on him because, he has incredible credentials. But my shout out is to the confirmation hearing performance by Gensler and by Merrick Garland. I was really just, it was inspiring to watch him and to see how deftly he handled some of the political questions.
Jay Rosen, do you have a shout out and or rant?
It's a half and a half, and this was in the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday. Amazon in talks to carry many NFL games exclusively on Prime Video. TV networks are expected to pay nearly twice as much for the new rights to Sunday and Monday games. So the NFL had a very trying season. Ratings are down, and now they're trying to take a package that Fox paid $660 million for and double the price to Amazon to stream the rights. So I guess it's kudos on Fox for getting somebody to buy a falling knife. And I'm scratching my head for Amazon because, as P.T. Barnum said, there's a sucker born every minute, and it looks like this minute it might be Jeff Bezos.
Jonathan Marks.
I want to give a shout out since I like talking about sports. I'm going to give a shout out to my Philadelphia 76ers. For the first time, I think in a long time, we actually have a basketball team in Philadelphia. So congratulations to Doc Rivers and Joel Embiid as we enter All-Star Weekend and Ben Simmons. But I actually enjoy watching the games now. Even though I don't watch them live, I do tape them and watch them late at night. So thanks, Philly, for bringing basketball back. And we're coming for you, Celtics.
Please. Won't be that hard.
Matt Kelly.
Well, first, I just want to follow up to Jay's point. I think you are right about Jeff Bezos. On the other hand, whatever billions Bezos is paying, I'm pretty sure he just found that like scrounging around on his couch. So, okay, that's what he wants to do. More power to him. No, my rant is about this cancel culture nonsense over Dr. Seuss and the 6 books that the Dr. Seuss estate has decided it will no longer publish because the books contain what we would now consider to be racially offensive images and stereotypes. And of course, as soon as it became public that the Dr. Seuss estate was going to cease publishing these books, Republicans jumped up and down that this is cancel culture for Dr. Seuss. I would just like to point out, Dr. Seuss's estate decided to do this of its own volition. These books are its property. You get to decide what you want to do with this, with your own property in this country. And unless Republicans are going to start seizing the intellectual property or putting a taxpayer subsidy to put out a book that people don't read anyways, these are some of the least popular Dr. Seuss books out of the many that he has read or he has written. Like, big deal, folks. And I even saw a interview with some of Dr. Seuss's descendants, his family members, and they said that later in life, Dr. Seuss came to regret drawing some of the images that he had drawn from that time. And he said, look, it was a product of a different era. When you are a political cartoonist, which he was, you're working on a time deadline, and I did what I did. And in the fullness of time, I see I don't really like it. And maybe he would have done something different. But it's nonsense that this is cancel culture. You get to decide what you want to do with your own stuff in this country, and therefore, fine, Dr. Seuss, you want to stop publishing it? Okay. I got 2 kids in prime Dr. Seuss reading age anyways. I never even heard of these 6 titles. So I don't think this is the end of the world. I think it's ridiculous that Republicans say it's cancel culture. Get over yourselves and stop using that cute little political phrase to just rack up your political donations.
Matt, would your thoughts hold also for the discussion around Mr. Potato Head?
Yeah, basically, it's the same thing. I mean, I know that I've got 2 Mr. Potato Heads in the back behind me there somewhere in the kids' room. Companies are allowed to decide what they want to do. They are allowed to decide to move forward and modify products with changing consumer tastes. And consumers are allowed to have changing tastes. We're not supposed to get rid of any accountability or thoughtfulness or reflection or changing views over time. That's perfectly fine. And that is not that we're canceling anything. We're moving on from ideas that we no longer think are fit for purpose. Come on. That's all.
I'm going to go full rant today, and that full rant is on Texas Governor Greg Abbott. In spite of physician, medical, and scientific advice not to reopen the state of Texas, he has done so starting Monday, 100%. He has withdrawn the mask mandate, and he has opened up everything just in time for spring break and St. Patrick's Day for those of you who might want to tip a beer or 2. It is a disastrous decision for the state of Texas, but not surprising. Why would he make such a decision? Well, that's because of his abysmal failure and that of his administration in our snowpocalypse, which has now cost the state of Texas over $600 million, has destroyed the energy industry or power generating industry in Texas, and caused over 20 to 30 deaths, although we may never know how many deaths were caused. Why did he do it? So he could deflect from his failures and his administration's failures around power generation, but not to be simply content with removing the mask mandate and opening up the state of Texas. He is now charged that the increase in COVID is because of illegal immigration and hordes of Central and South Americans and Mexicans coming across the border. He seemed to have forgotten that there's been no change in immigration policy yet by the Biden administration. Indeed, there's a nationwide prohibition from change from a federal district judge. So now we have, this is after the day after the first power blackout, Governor Abbott went on Fox News to say that it was AOC's climate change proposals that caused the blackout, not enactment of policy, not new law, but simply the proposals scared the wind industry and the nuclear industry and the natural gas industry all into power failure. So, Governor Abbott, you are trending towards the worst governor in the state of Texas, and that's a high bar. I mean, that's a high bar. You've got some real losers. I've known Greg Abbott for now 40 years. I knew Greg Abbott when he could walk. And now he has transcended into the most abysmal failure of a governor of the state of Texas. So thank you for indulging me, gentlemen. We will look forward to next time.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Stay
you for
safe.
listening to this episode of Everything Compliance. If you want more information, you can check out the full show notes when I post the audio podcast on Thursday, March 14th. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join us again for the next live stream of Everything Compliance.